I'm Dr. David Jansen.
I'm Michael Sanders.
I am Noelle Thrasher.
And welcome to the Highlander Podyssey. Hello, thank you so much for joining us on The Podyssey, a podcast by Gordon State students. I'm your podcast host, Michael Sanders. Today, we'll be listening to Katlin Stockwell and Noelle Thrasher. In this podcast, Noelle and Katlin tackled the task of dissecting the role of Greek myth in the modern day. They also talk about the importance of reading at an early age, how they think kids could gain a love of reading for themselves, and how Tolkien shaped today's fantasy writing landscape. You might even find that you want to crack a new book in the near future yourself. It definitely crossed my mind. All right, let's get into it.
Hi everyone, my name is Katlin Stockwell. I am 28 years old and a senior. I am an education major and my focus is on English here at Gordon State. When I graduate, my goal is to be a high school English teacher and I should be graduating in the spring, so that's incredibly exciting.
That is very exciting. And hi everyone, my name is Noelle Thrasher. I am 20 years old, a junior, and I'm an English major here at Gordon State. I plan on also becoming an English teacher once I graduate. And welcome to our Podyssey. The genres of fantasy and mythology have had a strong influence on both of our lives. In this episode, we intend to talk about the genres themselves, how we feel about them, how they have affected others, and our first topic is how the two genres came about.
Yeah, so my focus is on history, and the history of fantasy is as old as humanity itself. Every culture around the world has had their own myths and their own folklore that they've used to impart lessons or carry on pieces of their history. And some of the oldest works of classical fiction are fantastical stories that were passed through the centuries and across international borders, such as 1001 Arabian Nights or Journey to the West.
I'm focusing on the history of mythology, but more specifically Greek mythology. Greek mythology started as religion and myth. People told stories of the gods they followed, but eventually Greece no longer followed the religion, so the stories turned to myths. The myths were passed from person to person. Mothers told their children stories of the gods of old. These myths were later turned into stories by Homer. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, both famous works that depict Greek mythology. He wrote of Zeus, Leto, Apollo, and many other famous characters that you know. After Homer, there's another person named Hesiod. He wrote Works and Days and the Theogony. He wrote more so on the surroundings of the Greek gods rather than the Greek gods themselves. Later on, people passed down these myths and began to appear as motifs, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is called the modern-day Prometheus.
To move on from that, we wanted to talk about how Greek mythology and fantasy also fit together. And mythology honestly predates fantasy and has had a very heavy influence on most fantasy tropes. Some really popular ones are The Chosen One. When you think of The Chosen One, a lot of people will think of Harry Potter, but really all fantasy and mythology has a chosen one because it's a prophecy. Another one that is super popular is monsters and centaurs, and then also witch sorceress. Like Circe, but also like the witch in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. So
absolutely, mythology has always been surrounded by the supernatural, whether that means people being turned into animals or fantastical powers. Fantasy is often considered anything with supernatural elements, so mythology can honestly be considered fantasy. So it's a very fine line between the two. Myths have existed for a very long time, so it's only natural they get turned into stories, especially fantasy ones, because of that fantasy aspect.
Yes. And so there are a lot of books that have really influenced how we see fantasy and mythology. So as I am more of a fantasy gal, one specific book series that I can think of as a small child that really impacted me was the Bailey School Kids. And for those of you who don't know what the Bailey School Kids are, there is so many. One is like Gremlins Don't Chew Bubblegum, or Vampires Don't Wear Polka Dots, which were my absolute favorite. And then later on in life was Harry Potter, and now Lord of the Rings. I am currently listening to all the Lord of the Rings books, and I also love a Lord of the Rings podcast. So those are things that really impacted me as a reader and really made me want to major in English. But, growing up, I never knew that I wanted to be an English major. I never knew what I wanted to do with my life to begin with. I was super heavily involved in scouting for the majority of my life, and so that just made me feel like that is what I was going to do with my life. I was going to eventually run my own summer camp, but when I sat down and looked at why I enjoyed scouting, it's that I loved the teaching aspect of it. I loved teaching merit badges, and I loved seeing kids succeed in doing something. And beyond all of that, I loved talking to them about books. And I guess that's something that I never even realized that I was doing. I would distract them with funny stories from books that I've read, or what they did reminded me of some other book that I've read, or so on and so forth. And it's funny realizing it because I was constantly getting in trouble in school for my reading habits. In elementary school, instead of taking naps, I was going and reading. And so I would constantly have to change my little pin where it's from the happy face down. And then in middle and high school, I was constantly putting off work to read. And even now as a college student, I still do the same.
I definitely got in trouble for reading in school more than I should have.
It's just something that I guess you never realize that you do until you have to look back on it. Mm-hmm. And I even still recently I had to delete the Kindle app on my phone because I could not get through my work. I was constantly reading. And so it's just so funny how these things impact you. And honestly, through the education program here at Gordon, I found out that literature, and specifically fantasy literature, is something I'm really passionate about, and I want to encourage that passion in other people.
I have a very similar story with that. I didn't realize I wanted to be a teacher. I'd always taught kids my own age, oh yeah, I know how to do this, I'll help you, but I never actually taught people. And then I actually started teaching a Sunday school class, and I was I love this. This is so much fun. And I think being able to connect to those kids with books I had read, Chronicles of Narnia or Junie B. Jones, which was one of my favorite series.
Goodness, I love Junie B. Jones.
It's really cool being able to connect to kids with those books.
And there are so many kids out there who don't realize that they enjoy reading because they are stuck reading things that schools consider classical literature, whereas you can relate modern fantasy and modern mythology to things that they are reading now.
Exactly.
And how that can impact students. They all assume that they just don't like to read, but maybe they just haven't found something that they enjoy reading.
Yeah, I feel like kids don't give reading a chance because it's kind of forced on them. Mm-hmm. Whereas whenever I was younger, I got to pick what books I read for elementary school, and so I think that helped foster that love of reading because I got to pick. I got to read the Magic Treehouse books, the Jonathan Park series. I got to pick what I read, and I think a lot of kids, if they sat down and found a book they think they would they would enjoy reading a lot more.
Yeah, and so I think that's something that I really want to encourage students to do. And something I want to bring into my future classroom is including fantasy in the classroom. Because it really encourages students it encourages their imagination and how they can move forward. And, a lot of people don't realize this, but there are a lot of different teaching philosophies. So what do you as a teacher find the most important part of being a teacher is? What do you want your students to take away from being in school? And there are so many different, whether they want you to just be content focused. Are you wanting your students to be better people, better citizens for the world, or whatever? I think that fantasy really encourages empathy, and it encourages students to look at things in a different way.
Yeah, I think I viewed things very differently because I was a reader as a kid. A lot of my friends weren't, and so I viewed the world in a more like imaginative way because, you know, I read like mythology, I read fantasy, and so I viewed things very, very different. And I was very curious because of all the books I read. I was like, okay, what is fact? What is fiction? I wanted to find it all out. Like,
yes,
I wanted to know everything.
And like, there are so many different ways to view things. So when I was trying to find an article about how is fantasy or mythology important to students, I found a study that, let me see if I can pull it up, why they can learn more from fantasy than realism. And so this article I found, it said that they were looking at things, oh my goodness, I wish that I could find it right now. But it is a lab where students who were introduced to fantasy and students who were not introduced to fantasy, when they were looking at something that was very realistic. So the one that I found was a car rolling down a hill and why it stopped. Students who, or kids who had been introduced to fantasy came up with so many different reasons as to why that car stopped when it got to the end of the hill, versus kids who weren't introduced to fantasy were like, oh, well, it just rolled down the hill and then stopped. Kids who were introduced to fantasy saw so many different ways, like, especially as to why it stopped.
Definitely because of that fostering of imagination. I also found something similar. I found an article that basically says that children who grew up with Greek mythology and fantasy can read faster and write better because they have that already natural thought process, because, you know, children's brains are developing so much. If you already start them with reading, they have that already preset in their brain, and so they could read faster and write. They had a rich vocabulary and handled writing skills with greater skill. And I think that just explains why it's so important for kids to read, not only just because they love it, but also because it's good for them.
Yeah. One sentence that really stuck out to me in the article I found was that it said, a mind that has been freely associating with playful imagery is primed to tackle new ideas. And I think that's so true. There are so many benefits to pretend play, from like self-expression to self-regulation. And I think it's incredibly important because it develops your mind.
Absolutely. I remember when I was younger, me and my brother would spend all of our time coming up with storylines. Like, we would have whole universes that we had just in our heads. We watched a lot of like Marvel and Star Wars and a lot of fantasy, and read a lot of fantasy, and so we created whole worlds, and it kept us so entertained.
Yeah. And you know, like when you go out and play in the mud, it's not just playing in the mud. You're creating potions,
or avoiding lava.
Yeah, it's just, you know, like the classic the floor is lava game.
Yeah.
It's so important for kids to foster that imagination.
Exactly. And I think mythology and fantasy has impacted how I see the world so much because you see it everywhere. It's not just in that imaginative play that kids get. You can see it in you see it in movies, you see it in books, you see it in games, you see it everywhere. And, the vampires, the sirens, all the really cool mythological creatures, it's so cool to you can see references to it, and you wouldn't think you could.
Yeah.
And so that's just why I love fantasy and mythology so much. You see it everywhere, and it just enchants you.
Yeah, it makes life so fun. And there are so many different levels to it, whereas kids, it's the Little Mermaid, and then when you get a little bit older, it's the what's that show? The Once Upon a Time.
Yeah.
Where they have all the different mythological and fantastical characters all in it. It's something that grows with you. It's not just for children. It's for adults as well, especially me and you.
Yeah, I think we definitely are very good examples of that.
Yes.
It's affected pop culture too. Like Greek mythology and fantasy have just embedded itself in our culture.
Yeah. I wrote a paper in Dr. Davis's class in the spring over Lord of the Rings. I know I keep talking about Lord of the Rings, but
it's so good.
He is the classic fantasy story that has impacted modern fantasy, in my humble opinion. But he wanted to create a mythology for England, and a lot of people don't realize that. So it's based on a lot of Knights of the Round Table, and
like King Arthur.
There are some areas there where they inscribed runes on their swords and stuff.
Oh, wow.
Way back when, and that is one of the inspirations for Tolkien.
Really? That's awesome.
Yeah, so like you hear Bilbo named his sword Sting. That is not something that wasn't something that was happening everywhere in most stories. And so a lot of the mythology that had been in England were adopted from different cultures. He really wanted to create his own mythology for England.
And you can definitely see that in his stories. Like, you can see especially Gaelic, influences.
Yeah.
A lot of, Irish and Scottish. You can see that in his work because he's definitely trying to create a mythology, like you said.
Yeah, and that just goes into how mythology predates fantasy, and how mythology is really the ultimate inspiration for what fantasy is and where it's still going, especially with, we're both reading Percy Jackson right now.
Exactly. Me for the first time, you
for a couple of times. But it's something that is going to continue growing until the end of the world, I suppose.
Because mythology never goes away, it just adapts.
Yes.
There's so many mythologies that I just now learned because of my world literature class. It's so cool seeing these mythologies and how they will likely get new adaptions as time goes on, just as culture wanes and waxes. Right now, they're not as well known. So it's really cool to see that, at one point they were well known, and maybe in the future they will be again.
Yeah. And, you probably don't know this, but in the next series of Percy Jackson, so the first one is the Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The next one is Percy Jackson and the Lost Hero. One of the main characters in that one is of Roman God descent.
That's really cool.
And so it is something that is going to keep rotating and changing. And Greek mythology is super popular right now.
especially with Percy Jackson and things like that.
Yeah, but there are so many other different ones.
Yeah, especially like Egyptian mythology. There's a lot of mythologies that aren't as well studied.
Yeah.
I think definitely should be adapted because it would be really cool to see that broadened view.
And I think Norse mythology is getting really popular now too.
Especially
because
with
of
Marvel.
Yeah, because of Thor and Loki. And so I'm really excited to see how that can expand into something that's maybe not Marvel.
Exactly. And you see more Greek mythology in DC as well.
I don't know a lot about DC.
Really, Wonder Woman, which is, one of the main characters, she is on an island that is very popular in Greek mythology, and she fights like basic Greek gods like Ares or Hades. Like she fights a lot of Greek gods, and so it's really cool to see how that is like adapted into a comic aspect. But it's just everywhere. Like you could open up a book and find some kind of reference to fantasy or mythology.
Yeah, for sure. And you were writing in here, you wrote about all of the different ways that has been included in pop culture, like with mythology and stuff that we don't even realize, like Nike,
which is the goddess of victory.
Yeah, which is it makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
Because it's a sporting company.
Another one that I really like is Pandora, because Pandora's box, she's basically Greek's version of Eve. And so she was the first woman, and she opened a box that contained all the evils of the world and let it out, which is fitting for a jewelry company since, most of it's in boxes.
That's something that I never even realized.
Yeah.
I did not know that about her being Eve.
It's really cool because you see repetitions in mythology as well. So you'll see, like, especially with Rome and Greek, they take like a lot of influence from each other, which is really cool to see.
That's something that I'm really going to have to pay attention to, because I guess I never realized it. And, even from mythology to influencing fantasy, and fantasy being something that is everywhere, we see like video games and stuff being created because of it. So Dungeons and Dragons was created through the inspiration of different fantastical stories, which turned into the new video game. Or maybe it's not new.
Baldur's Gate. I think it's the third one, maybe.
I don't know a whole bunch about all of that.
I don't either. I really want to play it, though.
Yeah, me too. It looks like so much fun.
Me too.
Me and Drew have been talking about trying to find a dungeon master, because we want to do...
I would do that.
We want to do D&D so badly, but it's just...
Me too. I can never find anyone to do it with.
No, and I am, as a brand newbie...
Me too.
I would have to get a lot of help there, but we have been talking about getting Baldur's Gate when it comes out onto the Xbox or whenever that all happens, so we can play it together. And I'm sure that is going to end up being turned into a movie, just like Dungeons and Dragons just became a movie.
Have you seen that yet? I'm so excited to see it.
I loved it.
Really?
I loved it so much. I thought it was hilarious.
I'm so excited because I haven't played a full campaign of D&D, but in high school I started like half a campaign, and then everyone graduated, so we didn't get to finish. Yeah. But I love it. It's so much fun.
It's just, I think people find their DM, and then they find the people that they play with, and then there's no space for new people to join.
Exactly. And I think it's probably hard to teach new people because there are a lot of rules.
Yeah.
Which I understand, but I really, really want to play.
Like, I really want to do it.
Yeah.
And it's something I'm surprised that, like, my dad was never into. Because he's always been a reading fanatic, and his choice of reading material has always been fantasy.
Oh yeah, then I'm surprised.
I'm super surprised about it, and even my younger brother as well, because he's also a fantasy lover. But he's more, they both play a bunch of online games and stuff, like goodness, why can't I think of it?
I'm trying to think, like
World of Warcraft and stuff.
Or what's the other? Skyrim, probably.
Skyrim, yeah. Drew
popular.
and his dad both play Skyrim, and so it's one of those things where like you'd think it'd be more popular than it is, but you know, with TikTok and all of that, there's this. Everyone probably knows it. I'm very new to it, but it's called Critical Role.
I love Critical Role.
I just got really introduced to it, and I am obsessed with watching it.
Dimension 20 is also a really good one.
Dimension 20 is the best.
Mm-hmm.
I just used to watch it because of Brendan Lee Mulligan, because I thought it was funny.
He's amazing. He's one of the best DMs.
I love it.
Yeah.
I've been obsessed with watching them. Like I'll be on TikTok and I'll just like scroll through their whole. I recently followed them on Instagram.
Dimension 20 has whole like 40-minute YouTube videos of their sessions, and they're so good. I would watch them while doing school, like one after another. They were so good.
I have the full Dropbox, the full Dropout subscription.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I can't. I gotta see this whole thing.
I really need to see this through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's worth it.
It's really cool, and it makes you want to play even more.
Okay, well, definitely gonna go and look that up later on today, because that sounds incredible.
Oh yeah,
I love that.
And they have a lot of different campaigns. Like they have one based in Harry Potter. Mm-hmm. And then they have a Wild West one.
Okay.
And that one has some people from Critical Role in it.
How fun.
Yeah.
I love that.
It's really cool to see them collaborate as well, because it's such like a tight-knit community.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool to see.
Have you seen the EXU one that Brennan did?
Mm-mm. Is it really good?
That's what got me into all of it, really, because I saw a clip where he was like really acting, and it was very compelling. But the one where it's Exandria Unlimited, where he did a DM campaign for Critical Role, it's so good.
Perfect.
The next thing, D&D thing you do should be to watch that. It is so good.
Excellent. I do not have to work tonight, so that is going to be...
You're gonna love it. You're gonna cry, and you're really scared.
Excellent. My two favorite things.
The two natural states.
Yes, exactly.
Crying and fear.
Crying or fear. You know, exactly. Oh, that's hilarious. I love it. Okay. Yep. You're going to have to write that down for me, because...
We don't want the clicking sounds. Yeah. Let's see. Another thing that is kind of surprising, Greek mythology and fantasy have very, like, a strong hold on baby names. Like, Helen of Troy. Helen was a very common baby name for a while. Or, I've seen a lot of Daemons in recent years, and that one, also Greek mythology. Also Vampire Diaries, but...
Yeah, that is the first thing that I thought of, was Vampire Diaries.
So, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I've also seen some Heras, like...
Recently?
Yeah, and so I think the Greek mythology is making a resurface in names. And so you can look it up, like, a lot of baby names that are popular right now are, like, Hera, Persephone, a lot of the feminine names.
I have seen a lot of Persephone recently, because, well, you know, it's just, that is probably the most popular of the myths that I have been introduced to.
That one I feel like
Hades
has a
and
lot
Persephone.
of remakes, like a lot of adaptations.
And even with books as well. And then, goodness, the shoot.
Are you talking about Lore Olympus?
Yes, the Lore Olympus.
Yeah.
That's so huge. And
Amazing
it's-
graphic novel.
Yeah, and I've read a little bit of it. I haven't dived deep into it, or I would find myself lost.
It's a lot, so definitely do it when you have time.
Yeah. Right now is not the time. Which
Yeah.
is okay, which is fine. But that is the one that I see the most of, is because of Lore Olympus. And that is also one that you get ads for, or maybe just me, because they are targeted ads.
No, I get them too, but that's not saying a lot.
No. Out of me and you, it's not surprising.
Yeah,
that it's
exactly.
targeted. So...
Okay, so since we were running out on time, let's get to how this has impacted us as students.
Yes.
Personally, I have, like, all my family's really into fantasy, so I think just that natural affinity to fantasy has made me enjoy it more when it comes to learning about it in school. I assume that's probably the same with you.
It's very much the same. As I said, my dad was always a reading fanatic, and he has loved fantasy for as long as I can remember. So that is something that was always in the house. So when all of the Harry Potter books came out, he would get them as they would come out, and we would all read them together as a family.
Oh, that's fun.
And then when all of the movies came out, we would all watch them together as a family. We would go to the midnight premieres of the movies and stuff. And so, like, it was always a visceral part of our family dynamic. My mom wasn't much of a reader, but he really instilled it in me and my younger brother.
That's very similar with us. When I was younger, we would read the Chronicles of Narnia before we went to bed, and so we would beg for more chapters. But
of course.
Yeah, because Chronicles of Narnia, amazing.
I've watched the movies.
They made the prequel, which is The Magician's Nephew, is my favorite.
Okay.
Which I wish they would have made a movie of, but they didn't. But that's how we were. We would go and watch movies of, like, fantasy, especially Star Wars, Marvel, all that, and then we read a lot as a family.
Yeah, that was a very important part of growing up. And now, even as adults, we pass books back and forth. We talk about what books we're reading, what ones we haven't enjoyed, and why. And it's always a huge, like, group discussion with us. My older siblings are not so much readers, and my mom isn't, so it is something that is just shared between me, my younger brother, and my dad. But it is something that was something that still is super important to us. And I guess as a student, that has just transferred from reading with my dad and my brother to reading for school and enjoying and getting a lot more enjoyment and out of it.
Exactly.
Because literature has always been my favorite class.
And as we were talking about earlier, giving that love of reading to kids. Like, I think that is what motivated me so much to want to become a teacher, because I want kids to have that same joy of opening up a new book.
Yes. And, you know, in general, reading as a whole, I believe makes kids more empathetic.
I agree.
It makes them a lot more sensitive to other people's stories, and being a lot more understanding to see other people's perspectives and other people's point of views of the world.
Exactly, and I think that's why it's so important to teach English, not just for the reading, writing aspect, but for people to learn those social skills, because it really does. You learn to empathize with the characters and therefore people, and I think that's why it's so important for kids, especially, and us as students, because it reminds us of, you know, those important lessons we learned.
I agree. But I guess that is time.
Yeah, I'm guessing so. I am really glad we got to do this and talk about fantasy mythology.
Me too. But thanks for tuning in to A Tale of Two Realms, and maybe we'll do this again.
Exactly. See you on the next Podyssey episode.
See ya.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening once again. This podcast was written by and features Katlin, Stockwell, and Noelle Thrasher. Audio engineering, recording, and editing by me, Michael Sanders. Intro and outro music written by me, Michael Sanders, with help from Dr. David Jansen, also featured on guitar. Executive producer, Noelle Thrasher. And as always, Highlanders forward. Keep reading, gang.